All right. I mentioned to you last week that the first verse, probably if you were to ask Mark himself, would be his idea of the title. So what is the title of this work? From Mark's point of view, it probably is that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He means the whole book is only the beginning. You know, of course, that throughout Israel's history there had been, going way back, and again repeated many times, an idea that something was coming in the future, something stupendous was in the future. Most ancient civilizations looked to a golden age in their past. Unique among them was one civilization that looked for a golden age in its future, and that was Israel. And this idea that there was going to be a kingdom, there was going to be a moment in time that would change everything, when God would break in, there would be a time of complete and radical recreation. And this had been anticipated. And what Mark is announcing to us is this is the beginning of that new era. This is the beginning of that long-awaited kingdom that had been celebrated so many times. But it's only the beginning, you see. If you can imagine, Jesus gives us the parable of the mustard seed. If you can imagine a guy's going to write a book about that mustard seed. He's the fellow that's going to tend the garden. He's the gardener. You can imagine he writes a book. And the first chapter talks about getting the seed. The second chapter, tilling the soil. The third chapter, planting the seed. The fourth chapter, watering the seed. The fifth chapter, fertilizing the seed. He has all of this detail, and then just as you have the first little blade of that mustard seed break ground, he stops the book. He only wanted to tell you the beginning, you see. And so as you finish the last sentence of the last chapter, and all you hear is that little blade has broken ground, you're filled with a sense of anticipation, a little bit of uncertainty. We don't know what the long-term story is going to be. All we've seen is the beginning. And that's kind of the way Mark leaves us. Verse 8, chapter 16. These women run away in fear and joy. There's expectation, there's uncertainty. End of story. It's the beginning of the gospel. The gospel in his mind is going to continue not just for a month or two or a year or two, but is going to continue. He didn't necessarily know this, but here we are, part of the story, part of this ongoing, unfolding story of a mustard seed that has now grown much bigger and presumably will keep growing bigger yet, you see. So Mark has given us just the start. That probably is the reason that this gospel ends, as we were highlighting last week, so abruptly. Mark is, and this has been more well appreciated in more recent church history than earlier, groundbreaking. John Calvin, as many would say, is the finest, or maybe the first, truly modern exegete of the Bible. He's the one that broke free from a great deal of the medieval understanding and really gave us what was, in a sense, the new vision of how the Bible should be properly interpreted. Said this, and at the time he said it, it would have been quite a minority position, that Mark was groundbreaking, that Mark was wholly original. Mark had never read Matthew, Mark had never read Luke, let alone John. He was the first guy on the block. And interestingly, contemporary scholarship dealing with Mark agrees with Calvin at that point, even though at the time he said it, not so many people would have thought that was the case. So the first line is the title. The title is a title that refers to an euangelion, a good message, and that is for us a story. We are very happy that God speaks to us in stories. Stories are inherently interesting. Anytime a preacher or a teacher feels that the audience is drifting away, losing interest, what do? You tell a story. We are wired to appreciate story. So God doesn't speak to us in platitudes, philosophy. He doesn't give us all kinds of arcane sorts of descriptions of things that it would be easy to fall asleep, you know. He gives us a story, a gripping, compelling story. True stories tend to be more interesting to us than fiction. And so the gospel comes to us as a true story. It happened really in history, actual space-time history. This is a story that unfolded. It's a powerful story. I heard one guy say once, working with the gospel directly is sort of like an electrician working with a high voltage circuit and nobody cut the power, you know. You're just pretty careful because this thing could shock you at any moment. And that's the way the New Testament treats this gospel story. Paul says in his exposition of the gospel, Romans chapter 1, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Because what? It's wiser than Plato. No. What is it? Because it is power. Power. Paul knows that when he tells that simple story, on the face of it so foolish, so just childish, there is somehow wired into that story power that changes lives. And so we must never be ashamed of this simple story. And that's what Mark wants to give us as the beginning of this story. The story is about a person. The person, of course, is Jesus, who is unprecedented and who is unrepeatable. He is absolutely unique, nothing like him, could never have been anything like him. Anybody who could have invented Jesus never would have. Anybody who would have invented Jesus couldn't have. He is, in fact, someone no one could ever make up. And there he is, standing out in stark relief against the most unlikely moment in human history. He comes as the person at the heart of euangelion. In the Old Testament, euangelion, in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the word euangelion, gospel, was virtually always used in connection with battle. If you can imagine, we living in an ancient world send off our warriors to battle, and then we wait. We don't have email, we don't have modern means of communication, so we just sit here in a state of anxiety. The battle is happening out there somewhere. We don't know. Are we winning? Are we losing? We don't know. And we keep our eyes pinned to the horizon for the little sign of somebody coming to give us word. And as we finally see that little point of dust out on the horizon, we look at the gate, we look at the speed, we look at everything we can to try to figure out, is this going to be euangelion? Is this going to be good news? What's it going to be? And when in fact the good news is announced, if it is, then it's good news about victory on the battlefield. And it's no accident that when the New Testament comes along and begins using a word to describe this story about a person, it uses the word connected with battle, because Christ comes as a warrior. One of the most important parables that we find in Mark and elsewhere is the notion of the strongman. And the only way that you can plunder the home of the strongman is if you're a stronger man. And Jesus comes as the one who's going to plunder this strong man who has held this world captive. He's going to bind him and plunder his goods. Jesus comes as the king, conqueror, strong man, and thus from his work we get euangelion. We get good news. The one that ruled us, the prince of this world, has been destroyed, defeated, vacated, set aside, bound, and we have been liberated. And so this euangelion is a message of liberation from that which tied us up and put us in chains. At the heart of the story about a person is this word. I'm going to give you, friends, a little Greek every week. So just deal with it. Greek, isn't it? It's a lovely, you have to admit, isn't that beautiful? Who can pronounce that? Can anyone pronounce that? Take a guess. R-K. That letter that looks like a P is actually a rho. It's pronounced with an R sound. R, the chi, first letter of the name of Christ. Christos, with a guttural sound, arche, you kind of growl it. The last letter, eta, is the long E, pronounced A, arche. It means beginning. In Greek, we sometimes say, learning Greek, it has two meanings, but really that's not quite true. There's a subtlety here in this word. We have in English the word archaeology or archaic, those words which refer to things at the beginning, but we also have a word archangel or archbishop, which refers to one who is in a position of prominence. You know, in Greek, those are related ideas. And so to speak of the beginning of something is in a sense also to speak of its deep, essential origins in principle. So the beginning of something is also in some sense a way of referring to that which rules over it, you know. Thus, when we start reading the Old Testament in Greek, the first two words are in arche, in beginningness, or in the beginning, God acted, God created. The very beginning is also the time when God asserts his authority. John does the same thing in the Gospel of John. In arche, ein hologos, in the beginning was the Word. And John wants us to know that when God created, way back in Genesis, he was creating through this one who is called the Logos, the Word. So creation has something to do with this one who is the Logos. But Mark, before any of those guys had written any of that, also uses the same word. And commentators believe Mark is being quite intentional. He wants us to think about Genesis when he starts his gospel arche. Not just the beginning in time, like the start of the story, chapter 1, but no, the deep, essential heart of the beginning and that which qualifies and conditions everything that is going to come after. So that for Mark, the arche of the euangelion, the arche of the gospel, is no less momentous than the beginning of creation in the first place. There is a creation, there is a recreation. And in some ways it may be this recreation in which the king takes back what was lost in the garden, what was forfeited in the fall. He comes back as the conqueror to redeem it, to recover it, to reassert the authority that he rightfully has over it. This becomes the great hallmark of the gospel, the euangelion, when God is now going to reestablish his kingdom, his rule over all of these things. All right, well, how does it happen? The fellow that comes along is John the Presbyterian. John the Baptist. Well, you know, I grew up Baptist, so I won't resent that too much, but later I repented and here I am. But anyway, for the Baptists in the room, you know, tongue-in-cheek, I'm just joking. But here's the verse. As it is written in the prophets, or some of your verses will say in the prophet Isaiah, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Mark, interestingly, does not quote the Old Testament a lot. Matthew quotes the Old Testament much more than Mark. Luke quotes the Old Testament at some length in places. John has a lot to say about the Old Testament. Mark, writing largely to a Gentile audience, at least initially in Rome, doesn't bother them as much with Old Testament texts. And that makes this all the more dramatic, that even though he doesn't quote the Old Testament a lot, he starts his gospel off with the Old Testament, you see, as if to say, this is a point where nothing less will do than a citation to the sacred scriptures that have more or less anticipated this moment now for hundreds of years. He starts it with the phrase, it is written, usually translated that way. It's from the Greek word grapho, I write. It's the perfect tense, passive voice, gegraptai, it stands written. It's a word that was used in the ancient world to refer to law which continued to have binding effect. It stands written, thou shalt not do this or that. Even in the pagan world, that word was used in that sense. So Mark is using here a word that is going to suggest it stands written as a binding promise from time back in the past that this would happen. It stands written. What stands written? What is this message that must be realized here? He quotes the Old Testament, but not quite. This is an interesting little point. I've seen critics of Mark say, well, he's just sloppy. He's just not remembering the Old Testament that he learned in Sunday school, you know. No, this is not. Mark is being quite intentional about this, and there's an artistic crafting of two different texts that are brought together to produce this, which sounds like one quote. One of them comes from Malachi. Malachi chapter 3, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. Now there's Malachi, last book of the Old Testament, written about 400 years before the time frame we're here now in. And Malachi is leaving, hanging in the air, this remarkable promise, this expectation. I'm going to send my messenger. He's going to prepare the way. The Lord, the messenger of the covenant, will come. You delight in him. He's coming. Mark doesn't quote the next couple of verses, but if you come to the Messiah this December, you'll hear John Frankhauser sing it very convincingly. But who can abide the day of his coming? For he is like a refiner's fire. And that idea that this messenger of the covenant is simply coming as a sweet guy is not it at all. Malachi wants these folks to realize when that day comes, you better get ready. John the Baptist, probably alluding to Malachi, says, I baptize you with water. He's the one that's going to baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His is a refining fire. So get ready, repent, change your life, change your direction in anticipation of this who is coming. And then 400 years tick by and everybody's waiting, you see, for this messenger of the covenant to come. And then Mark tucks into that quote this from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And those two texts, Mark sort of puts them together in the blender, and out comes this wonderfully elegant combination of the two. I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare the way before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Notice the last line of the Isaiah text there. Prepare in the desert a highway for our God. But in fact, the one who is coming to realize that promise is Jesus of Nazareth. And already Mark is beginning to telegraph to us that this one who comes is not simply a prophet, though he was certainly that, is not even just the Messiah, though he was certainly that. But this is nothing less than what the Bible elsewhere calls Emmanuel. This is God with us. Mark is not usually viewed as one who hammers away at the notion of the deity of Christ. The Gospel of John does that a lot more than Mark. But with Mark, it's always just beneath the surface. The authority of Christ especially, the fact that he speaks the way one would think only God can speak. Who can forgive sins but God alone? The Pharisees complain as Jesus unilaterally forgives sins. You see, it's all the way through that this one that we're celebrating is not just a great teacher, great moral leader, this or that, how the world likes to tip its hat and pay a little compliment to him. This is God himself stepping into history, changing everything, and Mark knows it. And you see that hinted at again and again throughout the book. All right, Well, John the Baptist came, Luke tells us, in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius was the successor to Augustus Caesar, who was ruling when Jesus was born. The 15th year of Tiberius would be the year 28. And so John the Baptist shows up along the banks of the Jordan, baptizing there in the year 28. What in the world is happening in the year 28? I'm glad you asked. Let's just see. Jerusalem, as you're well aware, some of this I know you know, but it doesn't help. Sometimes this may be new material to some, and it doesn't hurt to kind of refresh our minds a little bit. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, Galilee, all of it taken together, Israel, is under Roman occupation. That is still fairly recent history. The famous Roman commander Pompey, when he was on his most important military expedition called the Eastern Campaign, was rewriting the geopolitical map of the East. This was his most ambitious undertaking, and some would say his most successful. He had just disposed of the king up in what we would call Turkey, Mithridates, and now he's working his way down the Levant, down through Phoenicia, through Syria, and through Israel, heading for Egypt. And all of it is intended to remap the East and consolidate Roman power there. So that's his mission, and he's being brilliantly successful. Israel at that time was independent. The Maccabean revolt had taken place in 165 BC. The celebration of Hanukkah is connected to that moment when Israel was liberated. In 140, Israel was an independent state and remained an independent state for a little less than 100 years. They were self-governing, they had no external power over them, but a civil war had erupted in the year 63. The guy who was part of the ruling family was named John Hyrcanus II, but another guy, a kind of usurper, had come in and seized Jerusalem, and now John Hyrcanus had Jerusalem under siege, and Pompey showed up. Now Pompey found this kind of a pleasing situation. It's easier to conquer an enemy that's in conflict with itself. A house divided will not stand, you know. Pompey hadn't heard that from Jesus, but he was smart enough to know it was true, and so he says to John Hyrcanus, hey man, I would be happy to help you retake your position of leadership in Jerusalem, but only on this condition. You bow the knee to Rome. The Roman Senate is controlling all this region, so you want my help, then you sign the contract, and you've got it. John Hyrcanus says, sounds good to me. And so he signed off, and as a result, Pompey, with overwhelming force, was simply able to storm the city, famously went to the temple expecting to plunder all kinds of silver and gold, walked into the Holy of Holies. It's an empty room. Indiana Jones is the one who finally found the Ark of the Covenant, but it was not there at that time. But anyway, that's when Israel came under Roman domination. There was a series of Hasmonean rulers. That was the family of Judas Maccabeus, the Maccabean revolt. But through some political machinations in the year 40 BC, a foreigner by the name of Herod was able to insinuate himself into the political life of Israel and was able to be appointed by the Senate king of the Jews. And that was in 40, and he ruled until 4 BC. We have a very negative opinion of Herod, and rightly so. But on the whole, he wasn't a bad king. He was an autocrat. He was terrible and vicious, but then, hey, you know, Eastern despots tended to be that way. And so, in some ways, he was just kind of doing things business as usual. And he did accomplish quite a bit of rather impressive achievements. He rebuilt the temple and various other things and so on. But toward the end of his life, he sank into unbelievable paranoia. Of course, you know the old saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. So, you know, in this case, it was really true. And Herod eventually died unhappily of awful diseases and so on in the year 4 BC. Well, his surviving sons, and I use that term intentionally because he had assassinated, I shouldn't say that, he had executed most of his sons. because he was paranoid. But 3 of them survived. And so he had written about 8 wills. In the 8th of his wills, he actually split up his holdings among his 3 sons. I hope you can kind of see that map. It'll kind of make sense as we go along here. So here's the map of Israel in the year 28 when John the Baptist came preaching. Antipas, known as Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod, rules the region known as Galilee. Galilee to the north is a quite important area, but not the most important. He was called a tetrarch, which technically would mean one of 4 rulers, though there was only actually 3. He was a person of somewhat doubtful reputation. He shows up in the New Testament twice, once in connection with John the Baptist, whom he had beheaded, and the other when Jesus himself was on trial and Pontius Pilate sent Jesus to Antipas because he heard that Jesus was from Galilee, where Antipas happened to have authority. And if you know that story, you know how that turned out. Antipas was eventually canned by the Roman Caesar Caligula, who himself was a whack job, as you may know. But anyway, he had heard a rumor that Antipas was trying to orchestrate a kind of coup and take over the whole region, and that was enough. That was the end of Antipas. So he was ruling all during this period of time. Off to the east, we have another son of Herod, whose name is Philip. Philip is probably the most admirable of all of the Herods who are living at this time. He rules a region on the other side of the Jordan, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee actually, called Iturea, good-sized area. Then we have a third son who rules the largest piece of real estate. This is Judah and Samaria. This man's name is Archelaus. He is fired by Rome in 6 AD because he had such an awful reputation. The Jewish people hated him. He was like his father, Herod the Great, on steroids. He was just dreadful, till finally the statement that Jesus uses in one of his parables, "We will not have this man rule over us," was actually a famous line connected with the complaints of the Jews against Archelaus to the Romans. And in fact, as a result of that, Archelaus was canned. He wasn't executed, but he was sent into exile in 6 AD. So he only ruled there for about 10 years. Archelaus is also mentioned in the New Testament by Matthew. You may recall that when Jesus, with his parents, Joseph and Mary, was down in Egypt, when he was an infant, they were there to avoid Herod the Great. When Herod died, they started thinking about coming back. But Joseph was concerned because he heard that Archelaus was reigning in the place of his father. Remember that verse, Christmas story, Matthew? And so Joseph decided to divert to Nazareth and stay up in the region of Galilee under Antipas, because as bad as Antipas was, it wasn't as bad as Archelaus. And so that was the decision he made. Well, when Archelaus was removed by the Romans, then instead of putting another king in place, the Romans felt like that's not working well, and instead they just put in appointed procurators, or something like a politically appointed governor. The most famous of this series of governors during that era was a man named Pontius Pilate. He ruled as governor from 26 to 36. So the period of time we're interested in the Gospel of Mark, of course, Pontius Pilate is in Judah, while Antipas is in Galilee, while Philip is in Iturea. None of these people liked each other. This is a time of conflict politically already, as a result of the various jealousies and so on, the politics of the time. We sometimes think about Israel in the first century under Rome, and we think that Rome viewed this whole area as a kind of backwater, unimportant, a sort of incidental part of their empire about which they didn't care much. Nothing could be further from the truth. This was one of the most strategic parts of the Roman world because it defined Rome's eastern border. This map, if you can see, that kind of yellow region in the middle is not Rome, that's the Parthian Empire. It was as big as the Roman Empire in the first century, and some thought as powerful, and Rome was constantly worried about the Parthians off to the east. And that eastern border for them was absolutely strategic. That's why we have such a conspicuous display of Roman military hardware and personnel in this area during the time of the Gospel accounts, because Rome had invested heavily in defending their eastern border against the Parthians. And so when we find Rome being so conspicuous in the descriptions here, there's a reason for that. And the reason is because Rome herself was worried about it. So part of the tension that we feel as we read the Gospel accounts is a tension related to the fact that there's already political tension, and Jesus didn't settle things down much, you see. He just kind of added in some ways to the tension. So that's kind of the historical, political context of the Gospel. At the same time, that creates an interesting sociological impact in Israel. First of all, in Israel, you've got the collision of two philosophies, two very different visions. You've got Roman imperial philosophy colliding with Jewish, what I'm going to call republican philosophy. Israel was not always a republic, but at this time, at least traditionally, it had been. Since the time of the post-exilic era in Jewish history, when under Ezra people came back to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem, the form of government had been representative. There was a parliament called the Sanhedrin. It was chaired by a character who was the high priest. He didn't have kingly authority, but he had the authority of the chairman of the board, kind of like the Speaker of the House, you see. And so he had a fair amount of influence, and the Sanhedrin was the ruling body, and that was the sort of political philosophy of the day in Israel. At the same time, you've got the imperial presence of Rome, which was much more autocratic. And those two more or less collided with each other, and that creates, again, part of the tension that we sense in the descriptions of things that we find in the Gospel accounts. Israel, the Jewish people, had a much more long-standing tradition, however, that they were a free people. You may remember in John chapter 8, the religious leaders say to Jesus, "We are the seed of Abraham, have never been anybody's slaves." Which is an odd thing to say. It was demonstrably false, you know. But so deep was their vision of themselves of being free. It went back to the Exodus. The single most celebrated event in Jewish history in the Old Testament, referred to more than any other single event, is the Exodus. And the calling card of the Exodus was, "You were slaves and I made you free. I brought you out of the house of bondage." And that was part of the self-image of the Jewish people down through their history, even in bad times. We are those who have been liberated. And even under Roman occupation, they still had that deep sense, we are a free people. And so you can imagine that there was a little bit of cognitive dissonance there in the Jewish world, with the Romans now strutting their stuff constantly in the face of these people who otherwise regarded themselves as free. Well, this collision of two philosophies created a confusion of attitudes among the Jewish people toward Rome. On the one hand, you have those who you might say represented kind of active collaboration. These would be largely those in the upper class, in the religious upper classes, also the economic upper classes. The merchants who made huge money in Jerusalem tended to be very favorably disposed toward Rome. You've also got the publicans, a class of tax collectors who worked for Rome, and others. They were quite positively disposed toward, they liked Rome. It was good for business. And so you have that, and then on the other end, of course, you've got a faction in the Jewish world that is dominated by an attitude of violent hostility. If you see a Roman and you can get away with it, you put a knife in their back, literally, you see. The sicari, the daggers. These were the zealot class. Interestingly, while they were certainly present in Jerusalem, the place where they were most famously found was in Galilee. Galilee was deeply Jewish. It was viewed as more rude than the more sophisticated life of Jerusalem. But nevertheless, it was viewed as a hotbed of rebellion. Josephus gives us a lot of information on this. He says those in Galilee were called robbers, which is his code word for revolutionaries. And so it was viewed as a place where revolt was always brewing beneath the surface. Galilee was not just a little kind of agrarian society where everybody was just kind of quietly working their garden. This was a place where there was a constant brewing sense of anger, hostility, revolt among the Jewish people. You have some of that in Jerusalem, you have some of it in Galilee, spread throughout the region. Then somehow in the middle, you've got another class of people who would never dream of violent revolt, but on the other hand could never view themselves as having complicity with Rome. These are the people who are treated very warmly in the New Testament as those who are waiting for the kingdom of God. You'll hear that phrase. Joseph of Arimathea is said to be a man who was waiting for the kingdom of God. Anna, Simeon, meeting Jesus in the temple, waiting for the kingdom of God. And you hear that, it's a catchphrase, and it's a way of saying to us, these were the ones who faithfully believed God was going to make good on his promise. And they were waiting prayerfully, not violently, nor compromisingly, but faithfully waiting for the kingdom of God. And the spectrum ran from one end to the other in the Jewish world. That kind of tension was part of the reality of living in Israel at that time. Well, this, of course, created in its wake another set of crises, and this is an interesting kind of overlay. In first century Israel, you would say there were two different visions of what the true religion of the Jewish people was. One would be temple-centric. This would say the heart of the Jewish religion is the temple in Jerusalem. They were very proud of it. They all were. It was a wonder of the ancient world. Herod had spared no expense in building this remarkable edifice, and it was well known and visited frequently by people from around the world as they could travel and be there. It was regarded as one of the holiest shrines of the ancient world, and it generated huge amounts of revenue, and the priestly family was more or less the beneficiary of that revenue, and they were broadly represented by a class of people or by a party known as the Sadducees. The Sadducees. We hear of them in Mark's Gospel and elsewhere. However, at the same time, there's another vision of the Jewish religion that you would say is Torah-centric. This goes back to the exile. When Nebuchadnezzar deported the Jewish people in 586, the temple was destroyed and they had to find another place, in a sense, another route for their faith, and that was when the Torah really became the heart and soul of the Jewish religion. The temple was eventually rebuilt, but many of the Jewish people remained tethered more to the Torah than to the temple because most of them were not in Israel anymore. They were the diaspora. They were around the world. And so little institutions, little sort of gathering places known as synagogue, coming together places, the synagogue became the Torah-centric expression of the Jewish world. So you have in Israel at the time many, many synagogues, and at the same time you have the temple. And while most Jewish people embraced both, they tended to be disposed one way or the other in terms of the practical expression of their faith understanding. So this also heightens the tension because the temple-centric folks, ironically, tended to be the ones more favorable to Rome. And the Torah-centric folks tended generally to be more hostile to Rome. And so part of the divide went along those lines as well. All of the Jewish world, nevertheless, had an interesting kind of common vision, a sort of self-image of the Jewish nation. And that, I think we could simply say it was this. The Jewish people, the nation of Israel, viewed itself as unique among the nations of the world. It was not just another nation. They had this memory, we are a nation of priests. We are a priestly nation. We are held to a higher standard. And as much as there may have been a conflict of views among various people, they still had this common idea that we are unique. And that made them very frustrating to Rome, because you see, Rome thought, we are unique here. And what do you mean suggesting that you have a kind of independent status? All I want you to get from this is this was a time of remarkable conflict and confusion. Factions, disagreements, and the complications of it, I think we would have to say, all concentrated in that one little area of the world, made this part of the story of the gospel much more interesting because it makes it much more textured. The final element I'd like to mention here is simply the religious setting. Some of this I've alluded to, and you're familiar with some of it, but let's just get it on the table. There were synagogues all around the ancient world, all through the Roman world. There were hundreds, literally hundreds of synagogues. This was the standard gathering place of Jewish people. There were many synagogues in Israel. Some were organized around various groups. I mean, they had synagogues for knitters, They had synagogues for masons. They had, seriously, they had kind of almost subgroup synagogues for various kinds of professions and so on. We hear in the book of Acts of the synagogue of the freemen of Cyrene, for example, that kind of thing. Synagogues everywhere. All synagogues were under lay leadership. This was not an official kind of expression of official Jewish religion. Synagogues were more or less grassroots. They were created wherever you had 10 men, you see, that's what it took, that was the minimum. Most of what happened in the synagogues was teaching and prayer. Lay leadership, teaching, and prayer. Scribes were ubiquitous. You could find scribes all through the Jewish world. They were something like the carryover of the Levites of the earlier Jewish era. These were technical experts. One of the notable descriptions in the New Testament is that Jesus didn't teach like the scribes. He spoke as one having authority. The subtlety of that is not that the scribes didn't have authority, but they always rooted their authority in the Torah. They were expositors of the Torah. They didn't view themselves as having independent authority, but the authority they had was the authority of the book, you see. Jesus speaks with authority, and the whole sense of that is he spoke with the authority of himself. I say to you this and that. Not the book says to you, not that I say to you. And it became a remarkable and rather shocking expression of independent authority. Not that Jesus was overruling the Torah right and left, but the locus, the root of his authority was not the book, it was Jesus himself. And that's why there was this interesting reaction to him. The Pharisees were a lay organization, a voluntary organization. In the New Testament era, there were probably about 6,000 Pharisees in all of Israel. You could join fairly simply. It was voluntary, and you just had to make a promise or two in the presence of some other Pharisees and so on. They were the practical teachers. So the scribes were, in a sense, the technical teachers. The Pharisees were the practical teachers. They had had a very impressive history, a very, I think, admirable display of courage, many times to the point of martyrdom, in the face of compromising forces in Israel. We again tend to view the Pharisees somewhat negatively because of their treatment in the New Testament, but they were proud of their history, and rightly so, and so we need to at least tip our hats a little bit to the contribution that they made. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were part of the priestly class. They tended to be much more jaded, much more cynical. They were really, I think you would say, probably the most faithless of the ruling class in the Jewish religion, and we see them much less in the descriptions of the New Testament. Jesus had much more in common, in other words, with the Pharisees, and that gave rise, interestingly, to more conflict with the Pharisees. The priests served at the temple. The high priest presided over the Sanhedrin. All of them could exercise that kind of bureaucratic authority. And that is the picture of the complicated circumstances into which the story, the euangelion of Christ, is going to be introduced. This is the beginning of the story, and the point is Jesus didn't come to a place that was just sort of benign, lovely, a Sunday school picnic. The gospel is introduced in a place that is just caught up in tension and violent disagreement at times, both between the people of Israel and the Romans and the people of Israel and themselves. And Jesus doesn't really come on the scene representing anybody, you see. He comes as a completely new and independent voice in the midst of the cacophony, the chaos of this complex time. And if we keep that in our minds, it'll help us see some of the subtleties of some of the texts that we encounter as we work through the Gospel of Mark, and indeed through any part of the New Testament. Now, I give you this once again, this point of beginning. Behold, I send my messenger before your face. He will prepare the way. This was a hard place to prepare anything. Here's John the Baptist preparing the way in the midst of this kind of chaos. He's a one crying in the wilderness. In the midst of this kind of conflict, he's out there in the wilderness voicing the message, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. I don't know how complicated your life is. This is a large group. By the way, thank you for being here. And even though right now looking at you, you look like you all are just a picture of sweetness and light. You just, everything I think is perfect. I'm the only clunker in the room. I think that's probably at least looking at you, you know, but I'm going to guess, I'm just going to speculate, that some of you feel like your life is as conflicted in various ways, maybe, as that first century situation. Maybe you've got the same kinds of tensions, factions in your family, conflicts at work, whatever, you know. We're heading into an election cycle. Have you noticed? And so if you're not having any personal conflicts, just flip on your TV. You'll, get there in a hurry, because we're dealing with conflicts in our culture. Election cycles always bring out, don't they, the differences. Politics, well, politics was there, politics is here. Life is complicated, and it's in the midst of that complicated moment in each of our lives that someone comes along saying, prepare the way of the Lord. Make his path straight. So whatever else is going on, let's follow the counsel of the New Testament, of Mark, of John the Baptist. Let's never get very far from this powerful, riveting story of a man who changed all of history and is still in the business of changing history and is probably going to keep doing it for a long time to come. And it's our rich and wonderful privilege to be a part of that story, which only began to be told in the first century in the year 28 AD.